The Calvexy speaker's crest snapped from blue to crimson the moment I closed my tablet and stood up. That color change meant only one thing in their language: rage. Real, unfiltered rage. And I had exactly 4 seconds to decide if I was about to end a war or start one. My name is Daniel Whitmore, and I was the lead human negotiator on Station Meridian 9 during what the history archives now call the Thren standoff. But on that day, standing in a chamber with 11 alien delegations staring at me, I was just a man, trying not to let my hands shake. The room was shaped like a shell, curved walls lined with light panels that shifted color based on the emotional tone of whoever was speaking. It was supposed to help translation software read intent. All it did for me was make every hostile glance glow a little brighter. 11 species sat around that table. The Calvexy, tall and armored, ran the meeting because they ran the Compact, alliance of civilizations that had been trading and fighting across the Thren expanse for 4 centuries. The Vashtans sat to my left, pale-skinned diplomats who spoke in careful, measured tones no matter what they were feeling. Further down were the Orlek, insectoid traders who clicked their mandibles when nervous. Every one of them had learned, over generations, that when the Calvexy called a meeting, you came, you listened, and you signed whatever they put in front of you. Humanity had been invited to this table for the first time, not because they respected us, because they wanted to make an example of us. 6 hours earlier, I had walked into this chamber with a folder of terms already written by someone else. The Calvexy speaker, a broad-shouldered figure named Vorental, had laid it all out like he was doing me a favor. Territorial concessions along our border, isotope shipments as tribute, and a permanent Calvexy monitoring post inside human space, disguised as a peacekeeping station. He called it a truce. I called it a leash. For 6 hours I sat there and let him talk. I nodded at the right moments. I asked questions that made it look like I was considering his terms. Behind me, my 2 aides, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Whitfield and a quiet analyst named Adrian Pruitt, kept their expressions perfectly still, the way we had trained for weeks before this meeting. What none of the delegations in that room knew was that this negotiation had never been about a truce. It was about time. Every hour they spent talking was an hour we needed, and now that hour was up. I stood. "We've reviewed your proposal," I said, keeping my voice level. "We're declining. All of it." The chamber went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had stopped moving. 11 species, none of whom had ever seen a delegation say no to the Compact in the middle of a session, all turned to look at me at once. Vorental's crest flared crimson. "You understand this table is where disputes end peacefully," he said, his translator device stuttering slightly on the last word, a sign his real voice underneath was louder than the translation allowed. "There is no version of this conflict that ends better for you outside this room." "With respect," I said, "you've been assuming we came here because we were afraid of what happens if we don't sign. We came here to see if you would negotiate honestly. You didn't. So now you get to find out what we do instead." I nodded to Clara and Adrian. We gathered our tablets and the small stack of untouched teacups in front of us, and we walked toward the chamber doors. Nobody stopped us. Nobody in that room had the authority to stop us, because nobody had ever needed to before. We didn't slam the doors. We didn't raise our voices. We just left, and somehow that silence was louder than anything we could have shouted. The moment those doors sealed behind us, Clara let out a breath she had clearly been holding for 6 hours. "That's it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "We're not done," I said. "We're barely halfway." Adrian tapped his wrist device, and a small holo display flickered to life above his palm. Lines of data scrolled past, numbers only the 3 of us understood the full weight of. "Confirmed," he said quietly. "Convoy 7 just crossed the corridor threshold. Full speed, no resistance." I allowed myself exactly 1 second of relief before my mind moved to the next problem. Because what the Calvexy didn't know, what none of the 11 species sitting in that chamber knew, was that this entire meeting had never been about ending a border conflict. It had been a distraction. 3 years earlier, long-range scout ships from Earth had drifted through the outer edge of the Thren expanse and found something the Compact had spent decades hiding: A shipyard complex, buried inside an asteroid cluster, feeding directly into Calvexi military production. It sat exactly on top of a resource corridor, the same corridor the Calvexi were now calling a human incursion, the same corridor they wanted us to abandon as part of their truce. We hadn't been probing their territory. We had been parked on their supply line, quietly, patiently, for longer than anyone at that table realized, and every single day the Calvexi spent trying to negotiate us out of that position was another day their shipyard fell further behind schedule, another day their fleet expansion stalled. They thought a truce meeting would make us leave voluntarily. Instead, we used the meeting as cover to move 6 convoy fleets of engineers and resource haulers straight through the corridor, while every Calvexi warship in the sector was busy escorting delegates to Station Meridian 9. I hadn't lied to Vorental in that chamber. I had simply let him believe the wrong thing for 6 hours, which is a very different kind of dishonesty, one that doesn't leave fingerprints. We reached the human transport pod docked at the edge of the station. 2 of our own security officers, a broad-shouldered man named Gregory Halden and a sharp-featured woman named Melissa Ford, stood guard at the entrance, both dressed in plain gray uniforms with no visible weapons, because visible weapons on a diplomatic station would have ended everything before it started. "Ambassador," Gregory said as we approached, "station traffic control just flagged 3 Calvexi cruisers repositioning near our docking corridor." My stomach tightened. Repositioning how? Slow. Careful. Like they're trying not to look like they're doing anything. Adrian's holo display flickered again. "That's not a coincidence. They're trying to box us in before we can leave the station." Clara looked at me. "Do we still go?" I thought about Vorental's crest, the crimson color, the stuttering translator. He wasn't a diplomat who had lost an argument. He was a commander who had just realized, in real time, that his enemy had been standing in his supply chain for years while he handed them a stage to stall from. "We go," I said. "Now." The pod detached from the station with a soft hiss, and for a moment there was nothing but silence and the slow curve of stars sliding past the viewport. I let myself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. Then the comm panel lit up. "Incoming transmission," Adrian said. "Calvexi command channel." I nodded, and the voice of Vorental filled the small cabin, his translator now perfectly smooth, which somehow made him sound more dangerous, not less. "Ambassador Whitmore," he said, "you believe you have accomplished something today. I want you to understand what you have actually done. You have insulted the compact in front of 10 other species. There will be consequences." "I understand," I said, keeping my tone even. "But before you decide what those consequences look like, I'd recommend you check on your shipyard status in Sector 9. There was a pause, a long one. "Explain," he said, and for the first time his voice lost its polish. "You spent 6 hours trying to convince me to abandon a resource corridor," I said. "You should ask yourself why that corridor mattered so much to you, and then you should ask yourself what 6 unescorted convoy fleets can do with 6 hours of your full attention pointed somewhere else." The silence on the other end of the channel stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Then, quietly, almost like he didn't mean to say it out loud, Vorental spoke again. "You used the negotiation as a weapon." "No," I said. "You used the negotiation as a weapon. We just declined to be the ones who got hit by it." The channel closed. Gregory, still standing near the cabin door, let out a low whistle. "That's going to make things interesting." "Define interesting," Melissa said. "The kind where 3 cruisers stop pretending to reposition and start actually moving toward us." I looked at the viewport. Sure enough, 3 dark shapes had shifted course, their engines flaring brighter, closing the distance to our small transport pod with a speed that made my chest tighten all over again. "Adrian," I said, "tell me we have an escort waiting somewhere in this system." He didn't look up from his display. "We have an escort waiting somewhere in this system. Is that true, or are you just saying what I need to hear?" For the first time all day, he smiled. "Both." Right on cue, 3 new signals bloomed on the tactical display, moving fast from the far edge of the system, human ships that had been holding position outside sensor range for exactly this reason. Not warships built to threaten anyone. Escort vessels, fast and maneuverable, built to protect a diplomatic pod exactly like ours if things went wrong. The Calvexi cruisers slowed. They didn't stop entirely. Predators rarely do the moment they sense they might have miscalculated. But they slowed enough that the tension in the cabin cracked just slightly, enough for Clara to finally sit down and close her eyes for a moment. "They're not going to fire," Melissa said quietly, more to convince herself than anyone else. "Not with 3 escorts on approach, and this whole thing already a diplomatic mess." "They don't need to fire," I said. "They just needed us to believe they might." And that, more than anything, was the entire negotiation in miniature. Nobody in that chamber had planned on violence. The Calvexi didn't need weapons to control the compact. They needed fear and reputation, and the quiet understanding that nobody said no to them and walked away clean. We had just broken that understanding in front of 10 other species. The trip back to human space took 11 days. I spent most of it in the small briefing room of our escort vessel, reviewing reports that came in steadily from Convoy 7 and the 5 other fleets that had used the negotiation window to secure the corridor. Every report said the same thing in different words. No resistance encountered. 13 AX. Calvexi patrol density in Sector 9, at historic low. Resource extraction ahead of projected timeline. We hadn't fired a single shot. We hadn't needed to. On the 6th day, Clara found me in the briefing room staring at a star chart that meant nothing anymore. Just something to look at while my mind worked through what came next. "You look like someone who just won something and can't figure out why it doesn't feel like winning," she said, sitting across from me. "That's exactly how it feels," I admitted. "We spent 3 years planning 6 hours of theater, and now that it's done, I keep waiting for the part where it feels finished." "It's not finished," she said. "The compact still has 10 other species wondering what just happened. Some of them are terrified. Some of them are furious we embarrassed the Calvexi in public. And some of them, if I had to guess, are relieved someone finally said no. You think any of them will follow our example?" She considered the question longer than I expected. I think the Vashtan representative watched us walk out of that room and realized, maybe for the first time in her life, that saying no to the Calvexi didn't end in immediate destruction. That's not nothing. That's the kind of thing that spreads. I thought about the pale, careful woman who had sat 2 seats down from Vorental for 6 hours, never once raising her voice, never once showing anything but calm diplomatic patience. I wondered what she was telling her own government right now, on whatever ship was carrying her home. 3 days later I found out. The message arrived through a neutral relay station, encrypted with Vashtan diplomatic protocols, addressed directly to me. Adrian decoded it in the ship's communications bay, while Clara and I stood behind him, waiting. The message was short. The Vashtan Council wished to open a private channel with the human delegation, separate from any compact oversight, to discuss what they called mutual interests along the Thren corridor. Clara read it twice before she spoke. "They want to talk to us. Not through the Calvexi, directly." "That's never happened before," Adrian said. "Not once in the compact's history has a member species opened an independent channel with an outside party." I read the message a 3rd time, letting the weight of it settle. This was the actual outcome we had been hoping for, quietly, the entire time, the thing that mattered far more than a resource corridor or a shipyard timeline. Not a single fight won against the Calvexi, but a single door opened by someone else, someone who had watched us, and decided the old rules might not be as solid as they had always assumed. "Draft a response," I said. "Careful language. No promises yet. Just tell them we're listening." Adrian nodded and began typing. Melissa leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You know what's strange," she said. 6 hours ago, in that chamber, I thought we were about to lose everything. I thought the second you stood up and said no, we'd painted a target on every human colony in the sector." "We might have," I said honestly. "I don't know yet what the Calvexi will do next. They lost time, resources, and face in front of the entire compact. That's not something a species like that forgives quickly." "Then why do you look calmer than you did in that chamber?" I thought about it before answering. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, We're not the only ones asking questions about the Calvexi. The Vashtan are asking, and if they're asking, others will follow. 2 weeks after we returned to human space, the full picture became clear. The Compact held an emergency session, this time without any Calvexi representative chairing the meeting, the first time in 400 years that it happened. 10 species, minus the one who had built the entire alliance around their own authority, debated for 3 full days about what had happened on Station Meridian 9 and what it meant for all of them. I wasn't in that room. Nobody human was. But the reports that filtered back to us, through the new Vashtan channel, and through cautious messages from 2 other species who had quietly reached out in the days following, painted a picture I hadn't expected. The Calvexi hadn't just lost a resource corridor. They had lost the one thing that mattered more than any shipyard, the illusion that nobody said no to them. For 4 centuries, every species in the Compact had operated under the same unspoken agreement. You negotiated with the Calvexi because the alternative was unthinkable. Nobody tested that boundary because nobody believed it could be tested and survived. We hadn't just survived it. We had walked out of that chamber, moved our fleets, and returned home with an open diplomatic channel to a species that had never once, in 400 years, spoken to an outsider without Calvexi permission. That was the real outcome, not the corridor, not the shipyard delay. The quiet, spreading realization among 10 other civilizations that the wall around the Calvexi's authority had a door in it after all, and someone had just walked through. 6 months later, I stood in a different room, smaller, quieter, with far fewer flashing light panels and translation software, just myself, Clara, Adrian, and the Vashtan representative, a woman named Alira Son, sitting across a plain wooden table in a neutral station far from Compact territory. "I have to ask," Alira said, her voice as measured as it had been in that chamber 6 months earlier. "Were you always planning to walk away from that negotiation, or did you decide it in the room?" I considered how honest to be. In the end, I decided the truth mattered more than the performance. "We planned it 3 years in advance," I said. "The moment we found that shipyard, we knew a truce meeting was coming eventually. We just had to be ready to use it when it did." She studied me for a long moment. "You let Vorental believe he controlled the timing of that meeting." "He did control the timing," I said. "He just didn't control what we did with it." She almost smiled at that, the closest thing to genuine amusement I had ever seen from her. "My government has spent 400 years believing there was no alternative to the Compact's leadership. Your delegation didn't destroy that belief with weapons or threats. You destroyed it by standing up, quietly, and leaving a room." "We didn't destroy anything," I said. "We just showed everyone the door was never locked. Somebody was always going to walk through it eventually. It happened to be us." Alira nodded slowly, then reached into a small case beside her chair and slid a data drive across the table. "This is a proposal for a trade agreement between our species. No Calvexi oversight, no Compact tribute structure, just us." I picked it up, feeling the weight of it, small and light in my hand, and somehow heavier than anything I had carried out of that chamber 6 months earlier. "We'll review it carefully," I said. "I would expect nothing less," she replied. "You've made a habit of reviewing things carefully before you decide, and an even bigger habit of surprising everyone with what you decide next." Outside the window of that quiet station, stars drifted past in slow, patient silence, the same silence that had followed us out of that chamber 6 months earlier. Back then, that silence had felt like the edge of disaster, the pause before something broke. Now, sitting across from the first alien government to ever choose humanity, over 4 centuries of Calvexi tradition, I understood that silence differently. It wasn't the sound of something breaking. It was the sound of something new beginning, one quiet decision at a time, starting with 3 people who walked out of a room and never once raised their voice.